Baskin. I'm the Sustainable Agriculture Coordinator in Crop and Soil Science, and coordinate sustainable ag programs for the College of Ag and Environmental Sciences. And I work with Dr. Kramer to lead the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative. And fortunately, we have Jessica Kudnick to keep all this rolling and keep us straight. So she has already told me housekeeping. Everyone, please turn your phones to silence. And we're going to get started. Come on in, and there's plenty of room at the table. We have got a really interesting topic here today, and it's kind of new for this group, sustaining Georgia's seafood industry. We know how important seafood is, and I was talking with someone today, and they said, well, I eat seafood, so I should probably come and find out a little bit more about this. And we know that a lot of places in the world that seafood is the major source of protein. We know that fisheries are under stress, and a lot of fish stocks are depleting. We know that the oceans are acidifying, and that is creating problems for seafood. So I don't know that they're going to address all these problems and tell us all the answers, but what we're going to do today is dive in and look at a little bit of this from the Georgia perspective. So we're lucky to have Bryan Fluech. And I did pronounce that correctly. When you see the spelling, you may not agree with me. But he is the Associate Marine Extension Director, and he is tag teaming with Tori Stivers. And she is a seafood specialist and works a lot with food safety issues in seafood, which is a huge issue, as we all know. So welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. All right. Well, guys, thank you for letting me come along. I do have to ask, just before we start, just by show of hands, how many of you do eat seafood? All right, so good. It's always odd if you're talking to a group about seafood and, like, no one raises their hand. So, fortunately, the majority of you do. But I just said, yeah, I appreciate you guys letting us come and talk. And I just started in December. I was at the University of Florida Extension for the past 10 years down in Naples working on fisheries issues. So when I came up to UGA and found out about this group and I started inquiring about it, looking and said, hey, you know, maybe it's an opportunity to talk a little bit on the seafood side of things, because I just mentioned out there are a lot of issues out there. I don't know if we'll get to all those world issues in an hour's time, but we'll do our best and at least identify some of the things that we're doing. So really, this is meant to or maybe that. I could give the whole presentation off one slide, but you probably would actually like to see some of the other. Our IT guy leave?
Windows 10 problem?
Well, it doesn't matter how hard we work to prevent these technical problems. It always seems to be something. Have we got Zoom people today?
There's two.
Open it back up.
I need to give a presentation to my class last week, and top 1/3 of all my slides.
All right. Shift that.
There
we go. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, based on this first slide, I just want to give you guys an idea of what we're talking about. So one of the first things is just so you have a better understanding of what Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant is. Talk about just provide an overview about Georgia's seafood industry. And I will say, when I talk about seafood in this case, we are talking about marine species. We're not going to get necessarily into some of the, like, we do have some freshwater trout that is produced on a limited scale or some catfish, but this is going to primarily focus on marine. Okay, perfect. Not only provide an overview of the industry, but talk about some issues that they're facing. And we just heard a few of them, how they relate maybe at more of a local level. And how Marine Extension and Sea Grant has worked with the industry historically, some of the things that we're doing now, and really the last thing is opportunities. And this is one of the reasons I'm really excited to talk to you, because I think there's certainly more opportunities to get people down on the coast and learn about how we can work collaboratively dealing with seafood issues. But in a nutshell, how many of you are familiar with Sea Grant, or at least have heard it? All right, we got a few hands up there. I'm glad you have, sir. That's good. UGA Marine Extension, Georgia Sea Grant, we are a unit of public service outreach here at the university. We're actually, our main office, and Dr. Mark Reese is director of our overall program, but most people are familiar, they hear UGA being a land grant institution, but we are also a sea grant institution. So at the national level, sea grant is administered through NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it's a nation-based network of universities that we work on coastal issues, and you can see in the case for Georgia, promoting economic, social, environmental health, using applied research, extension, outreach, as well as communication. So our admin office is here. That's where Dr. Reese is located, as well as some of our support staff and some of our specialists. I'm actually down in Brunswick, and that's where the bulk of our extension coordinators are. And we not only work on issues of fisheries and seafood. Tori's part of our unit too, but she actually works out of her office in Peachtree City to address the Atlanta area. But we also have staff that work on water quality issues, coastal resiliency, sustainable landscaping. Like I said, we also have a team that deal with fisheries. And then up in Savannah area, on Skidaway Island, we also have a marine education center and aquarium, as well as our shellfish laboratory. And so we have a network across the state, but we are focusing primarily, obviously, on coastal issues. This is not my day for trying to move forward.
Apparently you gotta go quick.
There we go. All right, so one thing I just want to set the stage, when we talk about seafood sustainability, that's a pretty broad term, and one of the things I just want to get across, these days there are lots of groups. I could probably have found about 50 other organizations, both at a local, regional, state, international level. The problem is there's no one universal definition. We can say it, in general, it's in some concept, it's, meeting today's need without compromising the ability of the future access to it. But whether you're talking to a chef's group, an environmental group, whether you're talking to a fisherman's group at a state level or larger, everybody's going to have a different angle. I will say in Sea Grant, we do try to address both the environmental and the socioeconomic aspect and trying to find that balance. And that word's easy to say, oh, balance, but my definition of balance and your definition of balance and what you're based off your income and where you live, we're all going to have very different interpretations. So that can make this issue of seafood sustainability very complex. Often, unfortunately, it adds to consumers' confusion about seafood. But in a nutshell, when we talk about our seafood industry here in Georgia, keep in mind, it's not just a fisherman. It's easy to envision some crusty guy out on the boat harvesting the fish or shrimp, but it's a complex infrastructure, both of the harvesters, the guys that are wholesaling and processing it, distributing it, storing it, selling it, and reselling it. And we typically think of local, just what's produced in the state, and I will be addressing mostly domestic cod, but our Georgia seafood industry also does include imports that come in here. And as you can see, close to a $2 billion economic impact. Now, compared to our larger agriculture industry, sure, that's small, but that's nothing to bat an eye at, considering the size of our coastline and what we produce here. But you still see that when we talk about our seafood industry, it supports thousands of jobs and obviously does contribute to our coastal economic engine. So, has everybody been to the Georgia coast at least once? I have to throw that. Anybody not been to our coast? Or afraid to admit that. All right, that's good to hear, because I will often hear that, you'll hear people say in Atlanta, oh, we didn't even know we had a coast in Georgia. Georgia, you mean that country over over by Russia? It's like, oh my gosh, no, we're talking about our state here. We might have a very short coast geographically, 100 miles or so, but we also have one of the most productive coasts. From an ecological aspect. So over approximately 1/3 of the Atlantic seaboard salt marshes we have right here in our state, and this tremendous nursery ground really is going to provide support for a lot of the fisheries that we depend on. And we're fortunate that in many cases our water quality is actually very good quality as well. There are certainly issues in areas where we are in Brunswick, where we've had some industrial sites, but overall, if you look at other coastlines around the United States, we're relatively lucky in that sense, that in many cases our water quality is still very good, which is going to help support a lot of our fisheries. So just as a snapshot, this is just giving you an idea. In 2015, you can see that 6 million pounds of seafood were harvested by Georgia fishermen within the state. Of course, you can always say, is this a perfect number? No. I mean, there's accountability measures, but there's always going to be stuff that slips through the reporting. But gives you an idea, and of course, over past, these numbers have fluctuated, but we're talking about a dockside value of over $16 million. And don't worry if you can't see all the numbers, but the main thing I'm trying to illustrate, if you look at our different categories of commercial fishing, shrimp by far is going to make up the largest proportion as far as the value. And what I'll do is I'm going to go through some of these in more details. Just up there where it says miscellaneous inverts, we're going to come back to that because it's a very interesting story as it relates to Georgia's fisheries. But again, you know, compared to maybe like a state like Alaska or Florida, certainly not as huge as far as commercial fishing, but again, look at what we're dealing with, and for the amount of land that we have and what we are able to produce is actually, in my opinion, nothing short of pretty miraculous. But a lot of that has to do with our ecological health on the coast. These days, when we talk about sustainability, one of the key aspects is, well, are they managed? And by no means is fisheries management a perfect system, but compared to other spots in the world, we are very fortunate. But the one thing to remember is that our fisheries in Georgia and the United States are managed for long-term sustainability. In that case, they are talking about that economic, social environment. This is a research-based or science-based process, and I'd be lying through my teeth if I said that politics doesn't get involved. But the general concept here is that we are trying to use the best scientific available information to make informed decisions that not only protect our natural resources, but hopefully still allow people to maintain a living. And what I want to point out here is that in the state, our fisheries are managed by Georgia Department of Natural Resources out to 3 miles. Okay, that's the line basically between state and federal waters. Federal waters go from beyond 3 out to 200 miles. That's what we call our exclusive economic zone. In the United States, our fisheries at a national level are managed through NOAA. That's specifically through the National Marine Fisheries Service, but they established regional management councils. And so we have 8 across the United States. Here in the South Atlantic, we have the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. It's made up of representatives of the state agencies, as well as different user groups. And some of them are appointed by elected officials, some of them you volunteer to be onto. But the one thing I want to point out here is that one of the key aspects of our fisheries management process is the development of stock assessments. And these stock assessments are management tools using biological information about the species that we're trying to harvest to give us an idea, to give us a map of, okay, well, what can we, based on this, its reproductive history and how long it lives and how many we think are out there, we're going to be able to harvest X, Y, and Z, but if we change this parameter, it might affect it in another way. Usually this information for our stock assessments comes to 2 very broad groups. There's fisheries dependent data, and that's where we're depending on the fishermen to provide us with data, and that's both commercial and recreational fishermen. There's also data that we get from researchers. So whether it's a university, whether it's a management agency, them going out and doing standardized testing, that information combined goes in to help make these stock assessments. These stock assessments then go in and help us inform and develop management plans. And this basically says, okay, if in a lot of fisheries management, I remember one guy tell me, counting fish are like counting trees, except you can't see them and they move around. It's never going to be perfect, but there are obviously methodologies to try to maximize that accuracy. But we also have a lot of cushion built in. And what I mean by that, because we're never going to be exactly sure that there's this many pounds out there, we build in a lot of measurements because of uncertainty. And it really is that uncertainty principle that we can go and say, all right, this is our best available science out there. In some cases, we know there's gaps, but we're going to still make that informed decision. A lot of times when we talk about fisheries management, it's about managing the people. The fish don't have, you know, they're not seeing political boundaries. It's who gets what, how much, but there's going to be a number of management tools that go into managing our fisheries. And that might be that, hey, this animal has to be a certain size, certain bag limit, that you can only catch so much in a given year. There might be gear requirements that you can only use certain types of equipment. It might be certain types of equipment certain times of the year. Okay, there might be areas where we're no longer allowed to fish because we know that the importance of maybe for reproduction purposes. So a lot of nursery grounds might be closed off. If you've heard in the news recently off New England, very large protected zone was just initiated by President Obama to protect sensitive bottom habitat. We have areas like that out here off the Atlantic as well. Also limited access. You know, and a lot of our fisheries these days, it can't just be like, hey, I'm going to go out and be a fisherman now. Basically, management has said, no, we already have too many people in the fishery. If you're going to go into it, somebody has to sell their license. So there's different ways of trying to measurement. And then finally, the big thing here is accountability. And that's becoming a bigger topic. Sustainability is certainly important. But if you talk to many managers in the United States, the central message is, if it is managed in the U.S., it is sustainable. Doesn't mean that it's perfect, doesn't mean that we don't have overfishing, but there are accountability measures to put in place to try to counteract that. And it's easy for us to say this sitting in a room that, okay, that sounds great, but keep in mind that does impact people's livelihoods, these decisions. And so we've seen a huge reduction in effort over the past several decades in the amount of people fishing. There's that balance again. And again, my definition of balance and maybe someone else's is going to be very different. The bottom line here, when we talk about managing our fisheries, it's done at multiple levels. So particularly when we look at our fisheries, by far our biggest commercial fishery is our shrimping industry. And Georgia has a long history. People have been fishing for shrimp for centuries, but in terms of what we think of our modern industry, Southeast Georgia, Northeast Florida really was the epicenter of where our commercial trawling industry began. Particularly in Georgia, our primary species are white shrimp, which is about 80% of our landings, and brown shrimp make up close to 20%. Anybody from Florida? Like you hear about pink shrimp, Key West pinks. We do get pinks as well, but a very, very tiny percentage. Shrimp are basically an annual commodity. The shrimp that we have out here live about a year, and if they're lucky, maybe a year and a half, and that ancient one might go 2 years. And also environmental conditions will certainly have a factor. So we don't have any overfishing or of shrimp, and when you do hear that terminology, it's usually due to environmental factors, particularly cold. Temperature plays a huge role on the productivity of these shrimp, and so in years when we've had really bad cold spells, that absolutely can affect the productivity of the shrimp. So maybe that year our numbers are going to be down, but shrimp are very resilient. You can bounce back. These are all trawl fisheries, so they are using large nets to drag, and this is how they are primarily catching it. And certainly there've been issues associated with that. And as you can see from a landings point of view in that first chart, typically it depends. Some years are up and down, anywhere from 2 to 5 million pounds of shrimp that we've landed. And that dockside value has fluctuated, and I'll talk a little bit more about imports, which has had a huge impact. But like I said, this past year, I think it was close to $10 million dockside value. What you and I pay for it can be a lot more. But probably one of the biggest environmental issues that we've heard about in the past with shrimp trawling is the issue of bycatch, that unattended catch that come in the net. And bycatch is something in fisheries, in most fisheries, that can be an issue. But historically, you know, when you're dragging the net on the bottom, they're going to catch whatever's there. It's interesting that one of the biggest things that UGA and Marine Extension has been involved with is working alongside the industry. And I think that's one of the things that we have historically been known for, is the relationship we have with our user groups to work alongside them to find these solutions. But by law now, every turtle or every shrimp net has to have what are called turtle excluder devices. These are metal grates, or it could be webbing too, just depends on the model, that are actually sewn into nets. This just came about in the early 1990s. Every single turtle excluder device that has been tested in the United States has been tested on board our vessel, the research vessel Georgia Bulldog, which we still use today. But Georgia shrimpers, I will say, have actually been ahead of the curve. This is Sankey Boone. He's since passed away. The last approved TED in the United States was named after him. He developed the first TED back in the 60s, and it wasn't to protect turtles. It was to get rid of jellyfish, to exclude them from coming into the net because they become a nuisance, which I'll get to jellyfish back. We're going to circle back to that. But that's a role that we have played working side, doing a lot of bycatch studies, looking at different types of gears to say, okay, if we modify it this way, can we still meet the federal requirements for conservation purposes? These days, if you have a turtle excluder device, through the testing, it has to be at least 98% effective. And by no means is it just because of shrimpers. There's been a lot of conservation efforts, both from the time they hatch to the time they're adults, for our sea turtle populations to rebound. The work with the shrimp industry has had a huge impact on that. They also have to have what are known bycatch reduction devices, or birds, and these are further devices that are put into the net to allow small fish or other critters to escape. Again, I think the target on that is at least 40%, which they do that, but there's also an issue that they can let shrimp out too. And this was something that we've played a role in over the years. It's great that it's going to protect a particular, a species, but if the fishermen are losing all their product, it defeats the point too. And that's something where we've played a role in making sure that we're meeting the conservation standards and these guys are still able to make a living. Our second largest fishery historically has been blue crabs. Anybody here from Maryland? I'm going to pick on Maryland for a second, because I know a lot of times if you ever meet, they would say, oh, we got the best blue crabs, and they're wonderful. A lot of the blue crabs that Maryland gets in Chesapeake comes from Georgia. So they're really probably, a lot of ours, but historically, we did have picking houses, and this has become an issue not just here in Georgia, but around the U.S., where we've lost a lot of infrastructure to support the fishermen. So where we used to have canned products and picked crab meat, that's really been through imports, but we do basically a live market, and we have hard and soft-shelled crab. So if you've ever had a soft-shelled crab, that's just a blue crab that's molted, not a different species. But a lot of what we see, it's distributed to local markets, and ironically, it gets shipped a lot up to the Chesapeake Bay area. These days, because the Chesapeake has had issues, they rely on other states like Georgia and Louisiana to supply their crabs. But this is a good example of a limited entry fishery, so they only limit so many, or only allow so many licenses out there. So if you're going to try to come into it, somebody would have to actually leave the fishery or sell it to you.
Did you say, let me make sure I understood what you said. If we don't have any picking houses, that anything you get that's picked crab is imported?
It doesn't have to be imports. There are still picking houses in the U.S. I'm just saying in Georgia, there's no more picking houses on that one. Florida has had a significant reduction too. I think that, Tori, I don't know if you know, I think North Carolina might be the closest crab picking house. So we do not have any more in the state. So historically, UGA even worked with crabbers and trying to maximize meat yield when they did it. But when you've lost all those processing plants, it's kind of hard to do that. I will say, though, a lot of your picked crab a lot of times tend to be imports. If you see blue swimming crab, that's not the same thing as a blue crab. That's a different species. So a lot of that will come from, like, I know Philippines have a lot, but yeah, different species. But you certainly can still find domestic picked crab. Just not going to necessarily be coming, well, it won't be coming from the coast, but like I said, that's become an issue in other parts of the U.S. as well.
So do we ship to, like, China or Philippines, and then it gets picked there and comes back?
I don't know much about blue crab, but I know salmon, a lot of the some wild-caught salmon that we catch in Alaska get shipped overseas to get processed because it's cheaper there, and they're flown back. Shrimp, same thing. So, yeah, unfortunately, when it comes to seafood processing, you're thinking, how is that efficient, but it's cheaper? This is one thing, I'm not an economist, but I realize now more and more when you study these issues, a lot of it's about money. When we talk about finfish, Georgia's not historically been known for this, although we do have a diversity of fish species, both coastal and offshore. Again, we have a relatively short coastline. A lot of times when you go on the coast, down in Brunswick, a lot of our local fish markets, you'll see things like spot and croaker and stuff that are white and stuff that maybe we traditionally don't think of, because a lot of your average consumers want the sexier tuna and grouper and mahi, things like that. So we do have them. It's just it's a small amount, and so it's not something that's going to be widespread. And if you haven't already started figuring out, a lot of this has to do with numbers games. What we have domestically, I know these days we want to eat local. There's not enough local seafood to supply the state, not even Atlanta. So that is one thing with seafood. That's why we're having to pull it from so many different locations. But access to it, living on the coast, it's a lot easier for me to go get croaker than maybe somebody in Atlanta. And there's the issue of how do you prepare it and handle it and cook it. Then you start getting into consumer education opportunities. But then we also do have some aquaculture on the coast too, and probably most notably is our shellfish. Clams, if you've ever had hard clam, and a lot of times you might hear things like cherry stones, little necks, chowder clams. These are all hard clams, Mercenaria. Those names I just spouted off, those are just different market size. We do have these naturally growing on our coast, our intertidal area. We have very large tidal differences between low and high tides. It's very productive for a lot of our shellfish, but harvesting them through the wild is not productive on a large scale, so we farm them. And clams and oysters, and I'll talk about oysters here in a second, they're harvested in approved lease sites. And basically what happens is the growers get clam seed. We call them seed. A lot of times they'll get them from Georgia. They'll grow the clams to a certain size and then ship them up here. They put them in sacks, and this is an area where you can see, well, they'll lay out these sacks in these intertidal areas, and within 18 months, they can actually have a marketable size clam. And depending on the need, they can grow them out to different sizes. You go up to further climates, one advantage we have here because of our warmer waters, we can grow up to a market size quicker than, let's say, Virginia or somewhere further north. But water quality is essential. This is where we're fortunate in most of our areas. There's a reason why you don't have commercial clam leases in downtown Brunswick. We've had a lot of industrial issues that would never fly because mollusks are filter feeders. So our shellfish, they're not only managed as a natural resource, but they're managed for public safety too. And a lot of work Tori does is is educating people about, in the industry about Vibrio and safe handling practices, because they can naturally harvest bacteria that can make people sick or worse. But again, these clams, once they're harvested, depending on the size, they are going to be graded out and they'll be shipped out. We do have local markets, but a lot of these also go up to places like Canada. So it's always interesting when you talk about local seafood, a lot of times those local products might not be available, even though we know that there's an increasing demand for them. Traceability is a big, big name of the game these days for safety and for sustainability reasons, but particularly with shellfish, because again, if they're being harvested from an illegal area, this might be a public health aspect too. So there's a lot of specifics about when products are handed over to ships, making sure you can trace it back to a particular location. So we can see this is actually coming from a very well-known clammer here in Georgia, and a lot of his product does go up to the Canadian market and New York as well. So oysters, it's kind of hard when you go to our coast, especially on low tide, not to see these mountains of oysters. And Georgia actually, at one point, this is a very common scene, but from a fisheries point of view, in the early 20th century, Georgia was #1 in oyster production. Now we're talking wild oyster harvest, but by the 60s, really, we fished it out. And a lot of that was used for canning. And historically, one of the things from a cultural aspect, oyster roasts are very popular. We get clumps of oysters. But from a restaurant perspective, these days oysters are very popular. The market, the variety, not having them in single shells was problematic to a lot of our industry members, because when you've got a big clump like that, it's great when you're just sitting there and chiseling away in large groups. But restaurants who want that nice single shell option, that was something that was lacking. So one of the things that Marine Extension and Sea Grant are doing, also with funding through Georgia DNR, is a few years back they opened the very first oyster hatchery in the state of Georgia. And this is an opportunity to hopefully to expand and diversify our mussel and shellfish industry. Unlike clams, where the industry is allowed to buy seed from out of state, they are not allowed to do that for oysters. And there's fear there are certain diseases that oysters can get. And that's a regulatory issue, and that's something that our shellfish lab is trying to work out with the state. But the whole purpose here is we actually work on different technology to grow out single shells through aquaculture, so that we can then hand this out to growers so they can grow them out. A big part of this too is this culinary education, because just like there's fine wines and wines are going to take on the flavor of where you're getting the grapes and stuff, oysters are the same way. How many of you eat oysters? Got the oyster? So if I eat an oyster from Apalachicola versus an oyster from here in Chesapeake Bay, there's very distinct flavor signatures. And even within Georgia, you could potentially have that. So there's a lot of the hope here is this is a huge economic development opportunity to diversify our shellfish industry, particularly with oysters, because we know there's a demand. Currently, we're not producing enough oysters even to make a drop in the bucket, but we're expanding that every year. Our shellfish lab is trying to continually seek out new funding to see how we can strengthen that, because we know that there's a need for this, and particularly since a lot of other states have shellfish programs, just even that competitive nature of being able to stay out front. And so one issue I will say, though, there's a lot of space. There's a lot more potential of having more oyster leases out there. That's going to have to be, we have to work with our regulatory agencies, DNR, to make sure that can happen. But this is something that we're open, and Sea Grant Marine Extension, there's a lot of promise that we can hopefully expand this. So earlier I mentioned miscellaneous inverts, and you notice there's a tiny little sliver. Well, one of the things that has come about in Georgia, and it's not just Georgia, but we actually have a fishery for jellyfish, specifically jelly balls. And one of the species we have is called a cannonball jellyfish or jelly ball. And several years ago, a lot of the shrimpers, as we've seen decline in the shrimp industry, they recognize that, hey, here's an opportunity. Anybody here ever eaten jellyfish? Okay, so usually you get that answer. But if we were over in Japan or China or some other Asian countries, it's hugely popular. And just to clear, everybody says, wait a minute, what would jellyfish taste like? What is that, heard? Rubber bands, I've heard. It's basically like marine tofu. It's going to take on the flavor of what you put on it. But especially in places like China and Japan and other countries, there's a huge demand. A lot of traditional ceremonies, but also it's a popular food product. And there's recognition that, hey, we get a lot of these jelly balls. Remember, the first turtle excluder device was actually designed to keep these things out. But now, some of your fishermen are supplementing this. They are using trawls, and they'll go out, and if they're in federal waters, right now, at the federal level, they don't recognize this as an official fishery. It's still kind of quote unquote in the experimental stage. At the state level, though, they do require turtle excluder devices because one of our endangered sea turtles, the leatherback, its primary food source is sea turtles. So there is some potential concern going, well, you know, fortunately, I'm not aware of any documented cases of any leatherbacks getting caught on that. But even Georgia DNR, for years, they said, okay, well, you know, we'll allow an exempted fishing permit. After a while, though, they realized, all right, there's potential here. So it actually is recognized as an established fishery in the state waters. Said at the federal level, it's still not. What's interesting too is when the jelly balls come back in, it's partially processed. A lot of it has to do with drying them out, salting them, and brining them. And then the second half of processing occurs overseas because the market's not here. The market is in Asian countries. So just to give you a quick idea, and this is kind of busy here. Just looking at landings since 2006, the red is actually the jelly balls. So at one point, within a 10-year period or so, jelly balls actually became our third largest fishery. Now, you'll notice in 2015, it's barely a blip. And it's not because there's not jellyfish out there, it's that the Asian markets fell out. So there's not the demand. You do have a fishery in South Carolina, and there's also an industry in the Gulf too. So they are hoping that it will pick back up. But you've seen tremendous growth, and it's not uncommon when these guys pull their trawls, and they typically fish more midwater, so it's usually pretty clean catches of jellyfish. And they use different webbing too to allow smaller things that can get in there to get out. They can pull in 90,000 pounds in one drag. There's a lot of jellyfish out there, but and there has been some mention of, you know, what long-term ecological impacts might there be, and that's still out there. And you know, right now it's not being addressed, and because of the market demands externally or for foreign, there's not a whole lot going on. But I will say, if you just Google or YouTube jelly balls in Darien, that's where the one processing plant is. You'll see some interesting videos out there. And you can, if any of you go to Asian markets, you can find jellyfish. A lot of times I've been told they eat them on salads, or it just depends on, you can fry it, you can use it different ways. Basically no fat, protein, has collagen in it. So it's not like you're eating pork rinds. But in terms of, and when we talk about sustainability, seafood is a highly perishable product. I just referenced the shellfish and concerns about things like Vibrio, or, you know, if it's filtering water that's not clean. Making sure that our seafood supply is not only sustainable but safe is absolutely going to be paramount to the whole industry as well. And we mentioned Tori, that's where she works a lot with our industry. Just like from a natural resource protection point of view, seafood safety is also managed both at the federal and state level. You also have cooperative programs. I gave this example of this National Shellfish Sanitation Program, where you do have joint partnerships between different entities to really make sure that any kind of shellfish operation is not only sanitary, but they're using best management practices to minimize exposure. Because especially for people that have compromised immune systems, that's why there's a reason why you see those warnings on restaurant menus, specifically when we're talking about consuming raw or undercooked shellfish. But when we talk about U.S. seafood supply, whether we're talking about domestic or imported, this is the responsibility of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to ensure that we have a safe supply. But particularly in Georgia, when we talk about process and distribution of Georgia products, this is going to fall upon the Department of Agriculture. And then, you know, and especially that relates more to your processors and wholesalers. If you're a restaurant selling it, then you're also going to be subject to local health inspectors too. That's more for sanitation purposes. But one of the cornerstones of the seafood safety program in the U.S. and here in Georgia is HACCP, or Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. And basically, this is a food safety preventative system that, instead of reacting after the fact, saying, all right, you know, we got a bunch of people sick, basically what happens is there's a series of steps along the food distribution processing point, and you say, where along that chain are there potentials for risk, and what steps can we take to either eliminate those risks, reduce it to an acceptable level, or properly label it. Because if you're allergic to shrimp or shellfish, it doesn't matter whether you freeze it, fry it, whatnot, you're probably still going to be allergic to it. So this is something that the seafood industry has been doing now for 20-something years? Almost 20 years. And now we see this in other industries, agriculture industries as well. But again, one of the issues too, and I'll talk about, is now when we talk about seafood fraud and mislabeling, not only could this have an impact from an environmental point of view, that if you're saying, hey, this is species A, but it's really B, and it's, you know, species B is protected. But the other aspect, if you're serving certain things that maybe have toxins in them, but you're describing them as something else, that could have health implications. So trying to make sure that we have not only a sustainable seafood supply, but a safe seafood supply is going to be an ongoing issue. And passive training is one of the aspects that Marine Extension and Sea Grant we work in. Tori, you typically do about, what, 2 classes a year with their industries? And this is one of the reasons she's over in Peachtree City, because we do have a large industry in Atlanta that she'll serve the whole state. But again, another aspect, I mentioned earlier about Vibrio, and one of the tools that we have is the safeoysters.org site that is used nationally and internationally. That's for various audiences, so whether you need more technical information or for consumer about just proper handling and issues or information about things like Vibrio. But this is going to be one way that we're providing support to Georgia's seafood industry. And particularly these rules change, and that's one thing too, is not only saying we're going to have a class, but when we do have these changes, how does it affect the industry? Things like the Food Safety Modernization Act. How do products have to be stored when they're going across I-95? What practices might a company have to change? Chances are they're going to probably have some economic purse strings associated with that too. So we're trying to stay ahead of when these changes happen so that we can work along the industry to minimize those impacts. One of the other things too is a lot of times people, where can I get Georgia seafood? We recognize that maybe we're not always going to have it available all the time, but being able to find it. And so this is another thing that Tori has done a fantastic job on, this Georgia Seafood Directory. And it's voluntary, so it's an opportunity for companies that are selling Georgia seafood products to get that information out there. So for wholesale and retail, you can see it also provides species descriptions just to even give some basic flavor attributes and how it's harvested as a consumer information, because we know people want to be able to support local fisheries, but they don't necessarily always know how to get it. So you can imagine, and this slide alone we could spend a week on if we really wanted to talk on this, but there are multiple issues that the industry is facing, and a lot of them, some of them have been happening for decades, some of them are more recent, some are happening more local, and some of them are external factors. I would say by all means, and I'll go more into imports, the amount of seafood we import now, and I'll go into more specifics here in a second, is staggering, and particularly even in the past 10, 15 years, that's changed. But there's been a number of other issues, but I always give the analogy of death by 1,000 cuts. The industry has faced several blows over the years, and they've bounced back. They're very resilient. And, you know, I've had people say, well, you know, in 10 years, are we even going to have an industry left? I would say we're always going to have an industry, but is it going to look like what it did maybe 30, 40 years ago? No. And this is certainly not a Georgia issue. We see this across the United States. But there's been a lot of social and economic factors that have contributed impacted the health and sustainability of our industry. Some things like environmental factors. I heard acidification. That is a real issue for some of our shellfish growers across the United States, going, well, if we change the pH of the ocean water, what impact might that have on the strength of the mollusk shells or a shrimp shell? These are all things that sometimes the answer is not black and white, and there's a lot of unknowns. But it's something that even now in Georgia here, we're having industry members say, you know, what impacts climate change going to have on our fisheries? In many cases, it might be we don't know yet, but it's one of the things you're trying to stay out of. Now, particularly when it comes to imports, you have to realize this day and age, seafood is a global market. You could get something from Australia and get it to your restaurant probably within 24 hours with some of the different strategies. It might cost you an arm and a leg, but bottom line, we know at a global scale, we have more people that are in that middle class bracket. They can afford seafood. There's more demand. We've had new technologies, particularly things in aquaculture. If we look at world production and basically what's going to happen from wild caught fisheries, it's pretty much static. We have some fisheries that have rebounded. We have some fisheries that are absolutely depleted. But even with all our technological advances and management actions, overall world wild caught production static, where we're seeing huge leaps and bounds of aquaculture. Over 50% now of the seafood we eat is being produced through aquaculture, different technologies. And again, it's not just, hey, we've got seafood here in Georgia. We have to contend with all the other happenings around the country and the world, and more people are wanting. We're being told to eat more seafood too. Big question is, do we have enough? We're always saying, hey, we don't even have enough local supply. How are we going to bring that in to meet that? I think less than 1 in 5 Americans meet the dietary requirements of having at least 2 servings a week. Where's that extra seafood going to come from? So aquaculture has been a good thing in the sense that we're being able to produce more, but it has absolutely had economic and social impacts on our industries. So you can see it's over 91% of that seafood that we eat now is imported. So second to oil, seafood is the largest trade deficit in the U.S. besides oil. And I think even when you started, you said that in the past 15 years, the amount of imports keep going up and up and up. And we talked about earlier, even some of that is U.S. domestic seafood that we catch here, we send overseas and then bring it back. And a lot of that has to do just with regulatory factors, because it can be cheaper to send it overseas, process it where maybe the rules aren't as strict, and bring it back. We can't compete quantity. Over 90% of the shrimp we eat in the United States is imported. The last time shrimp exports exceeded imports was the late 70s. Shrimp used to be a specialty item. It was for special occasions. Now, we can go to Long John Silver, we can go to Olive Garden, we can go anywhere and have shrimp 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We like it. We want our shrimp. And shrimp has been the #1 seafood product we've consumed now for the past, I think, since about 2000. We love our shrimp. This consistent year-round supply, that's a lot of times aquaculture and imports get bashed, depending, and there are some horror stories, and I'm not trying to say favor one way or another, but there's a lot of success stories where the technology keeps improving, and because of a lot of the demands from consumer groups. You know, when places like Walmart and Target say, hey, unless you start producing this way, we're not going to buy, companies listen. Say what you will about Walmart, they're one of the biggest seafood buyers in the world, but they are going to have some say on, you know, where we want, what kind of product we want, how we want it, and that year-round consistent supply is, we're seeing more and more of that. But bottom line is, what we catch locally, we can't meet local demand, and it becomes a numbers game. We like what we like. Over 90% of what we eat comes from 10 main variety groups. Like I said, shrimp is #1. A quarter of the per capita consumption, which I'll show you in a sec, is coming from shrimp. Of these products, I see about 2 up here that are only wild caught. Okay, so your pollock, your cod, it doesn't mean there probably haven't been, and I mean large scale aquaculture, but all these other ones, there's both aquaculture production and wild caught, and some of these we've seen dramatic. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, tilapia would have never been on here. You think about 15 years ago, did you ever hear of tilapia? How many of you know what pangasius is? Catfish. Okay? This only showed up in the past 6 years in the top 10 list, and within the last 5, it has moved up 3 spots. It's affordable, okay, we can access it, and you know, guess what? It doesn't taste like fish. As Americans, we don't like fishy fish. We don't like the strong flavor stuff that a lot of times has the strongest nutritional benefits. This tastes whatever, you know, hey, fry it, bread it, that's going to be awesome. Swai is another name, basa, I mean, there's different species of it, but pangasius is a catfish. And then I mentioned the per capita consumption. It's again, we're being told to eat more seafood. Okay, but look at that per capita consumption of seafood, 14 pounds compared to something like chicken. And again, you look at productivity, chicken versus, I mean, in Georgia too, I know we're a big chicken state. But it's saying, where's that seafood going to come from? People want local. There's going to have to be other avenues of that. And again, of that 14.6 pounds, roughly a quarter of that is shrimp alone. And unfortunately, that number too, I mean, seafood can be expensive, depending on what you're buying. So especially when the recession hit, we saw drops of that too. But now that we know that, hey, seafood is good for you, we know there's a lot of research that the benefits far exceed potential risk associated with it. Eat more of it, yet a lot of times there's a lot of confusion about where we're getting it from and who's catching it and how to prepare it. This is kind of a busy slide, but the point I'm trying to make here, this is actually showing landings and effort, how much effort goes into catching shrimp since 1989. And one thing in fisheries, you'll hear people say, well, what are the landings? Are the landings up or down this year? Landings by themselves doesn't really tell you a lot. Because what you're trying to figure out, okay, is it the same number of people fishing, or do you have twice as many people catching the same amount, or do you only have like a tenth of it? So you always have to look at landings in conjunction with how many people, how much effort is going into it. So yeah, in the past several years, we've seen a 32% decline in landings in shrimp. So it's easy to say on the surface, oh, our shrimp populations are going down. Actually, our shrimp populations are fine. The effort, the red line has gone down over 66%. That's the number of fishermen out there. So, perfect example, 1979, in the state of Georgia, there were over 1,400 shrimp trawling licenses, commercial licenses. 2016 so far, 212. That was like 2 months ago. We've seen a tremendous drop in the number of people out there. And, you know, some people might argue, well, from an ecological aspect, maybe that's not such a bad thing. And that's a fair argument. However, a lot of like farming, you hear a lot these days where, you know, like farming, shrimping a lot of times is multi-generational families. And like farming, you're starting to hear a lot of fishermen saying, I don't want my kids doing this. So where you've had third, fourth, fifth generation, now it's like, nope, Johnny's going somewhere else. Average age of our boats, our shrimp boats, are probably, I think, a little over 50 years. Okay, your average age of your, I think over 40 years, average age of your shrimper is over 50. So we want local, but are we even going to be able to supply that local? There's questions. Being able to repair your boat these days is getting to the point now where it's just not cost feasible to meet Coast Guard standards. Safety is important. No one's denying that, but how do you do that when these guys are living check to check, if that at all? But so we've seen tremendous drops in effort. Yes.
Well, so I feel like I'm missing a piece of the puzzle, because you are maintaining that the shrimp population is out there, but the harvest has gone down because we have fewer shrimpers. If there's an abundance of shrimp out there, then, I mean, what is it that is driving them? I thought they were having to make more trips and not hauling as much.
If you actually look at test per unit effort, it's actually up. The fishermen that are still in the business, these guys that are doing it now are working more efficient. So again, if you look at how much effort, or the guys that are actually doing it, they're getting higher yields, but it's not, a lot of it has to do with price. That's, price is the big.
And that's from the imports.
Yeah. There's shrimp out there, and that's to say, we have a very well-managed fishery, but because from an economic aspect, they just can't compete. This summer, I'll give you a perfect example. We had brown shrimp. The guys were getting 55 cents a pound. Guys they weren't even keeping it because they can't, 55 cents, that's not even before you get charged for the ice and boxing fees. Yet we know that people are willing to pay a lot more of that. So they'll get into this with some of the local food movement stuff. So yeah, a lot of this has to do with just, we can't compete on the quantity that comes into our country now. But there is hope, because we know that people are willing to pay more for local product. But in terms of quantity, yeah. Is there more potential to harvest more of our local shrimp? Trust me, the fishermen are asking, like, hey, can we fish in the sounds? Can we fish? Some of that's going to be on a regulatory issue, but it's not to say there aren't shrimp out there. It's just sometimes that might be a management decision. One other kick to the pants here is just one other factor. This is something called black gill. And this is something that was first discovered in Georgia shrimp back in 1996, but particularly since about 2012-13, we've seen significant cases of it. You can see why it's called black gill. These are the gills of the shrimp, and this is immune response. Basically, it's a parasitic infection by something called a ciliate, a single-celled organism that gets into the shrimp, and basically, as a result, the shrimp produces melanin. It forms it over the ciliate. The shrimp is completely safe to eat. It's not a health issue to adults. But there are, through some of the research that Sea Grant that has been working with Skidaway Institute of Oceanography, realizing that these shrimp, when they get this, it becomes a respiratory issue. Anybody ever seen the YouTube video of the shrimp on the treadmill? For a while, everyone's like, oh, wasting taxpayers' money. Well, what they were actually doing is they built a treadmill for a shrimp, and it's on YouTube, like everything else, to test that if these shrimp have black gill, how does it affect them physiologically? And what they found is shrimp with black gill collapsed in almost half the time that healthy shrimp. What does that translate in the wild? If you're going to crash out, guess what? You're going to eat a lot quicker. So concerns about secondary mortality. In the past year, they've also started seeing direct evidence of direct mortality. To a lot of the fishermen, their fear that some of the drops and landings, in addition to not having as many people fishing, has been attributed to black gill. From a management perspective, the jury is still kind of out, because they're saying, where's the body count? If all these shrimp are dying, where are they? And that's a good question. Granted, everything in the ocean eats shrimp, so maybe that could be part of it. But this is something that has become a pressing issue for a lot of our fishermen. Blackgill's been found from Virginia all the way through Texas, but for some reason, the epicenter is in Georgia and South Carolina. We still don't have a positive identification on the ciliate, which will be a huge help because without knowing that direct life history and how to respond is going to be crucial. But ultimately, the plan is, can we be able to have models that we can predict that if certain environmental conditions happen, maybe the blackgill is going to be worse or not as worse, and then can we make corrective actions? We're not there yet, but this is just one other death by 1,000 cuts that is impacted when you've already had so many other external factors out there. So this is kind of what got me interested in this group here, that we know that local food myths, I mean, there's more, demand for local supply these days. And a central question came up going, well, wait a minute, is there a possibility of being able to use the local food movement as a way to support Georgia's seafood? And this was actually a research project that Emory University did through funding with Georgia Sea Grant with this principal question here. And basically what they did, they were looking at direct marketing opportunities. And this was a series of interviews with community-supported agriculture groups, farmers markets, as well as farm-to-fork restaurants, both in Atlanta and the Athens area. And that's what a lot of this paperwork is dealing with. And part of it was surveying these different user groups on their perceptions, their demand, or not demand, but their interest. Are they interested in local seafood? What are some of their, what about sustainability? What are they willing to pay? On the flip side of this, they also looked at, okay, from the industry perspective, what are some of the barriers? And I can provide you, we can have summaries of the research itself. I don't know if I have copies for everybody, but I also have a summary report here as well, just talk a little bit about direct marketing. But in a nutshell, I can send all that out, people were very interested. There's a lot of opportunities, and across the country, one of the things that we're seeing, just like you've got community-supported agriculture, where people go and pay money up front to say, all right, over the next year or how long, I'm going to get a certain share of a product. And if we're growing kale, you're going to get kale. And now there's aggregate CSAs, or maybe they can diversify. But we're starting to see more things, community-supported fisheries. Same concept. Group of people go in, pay their price up front in return of getting a seafood product. We don't have any here in our state. The closest one is Charleston. Particularly out west in New England, you have some successful projects going on, but you're basically trying to shorten that food chain or the distribution chain between the producers and the consumers. So this is one of the things that we're finding, and the feedback we're getting from a lot of the people that are interested in local foods might be a potential model. However, there are significant barriers. And again, this research project really just started looking at this. Getting the seafood is very highly perishable. There's a lot of rules that really dictate how that needs to be handled from a food safety perspective. But just distance alone, this is your common way that you see a lot of times. Guys loading up their shrimp and putting a bunch of ice and then seeing if they can get it out to the local market. Unlike a local farmer, though, okay, it's hard for a shrimper, especially if it's just himself and his two crewmen, to just go pull the boat over, take their product, and then drive up to Atlanta for a weekend. The trade-off there is not equitable. A lot of times, again, we're seeing, whereas historically you might have had the whole family fishing, now it might just be one person, so you don't have that extra help. There's also regulatory constraints and also seasonality. Sometimes the fishery's closed. You might not be able to provide that year-round access. And then even, again, this idea of this relationship, a lot of our docks, when the fishermen pull up, they have agreements with the processors. They're not going to be able to go sell their seafood necessarily on their own. There's going to be channels, and in many cases, you don't want that. Again, this goes back to the HACCP training to make sure that the seafood is actually being handled properly. So it doesn't mean these are insurmountable, but these were certainly barriers that the industry members identified through part of this research. But bottom line, through the survey, it was overwhelming. I mean, 75, 80, 90% interested. Yes, we want Georgia products. We actually are willing to try different things, and that's different from what we see at a national level where we like what we like. Okay, sure, spot, I'll try spot. A lot of different things that are trying to do different forms, especially a lot of chefs now. They want that. That's one of the things that as a marketing tool, they're able to say, hey, I've got this, whiting that maybe some people don't want it, but I can make it taste incredible. And then the other aspect, and this is why some of these sheets here, they had a fisheries economist work on this project and developed a variety of enterprise budgets to break down, okay, if you're going to go from Brunswick to Athens or Brunswick to Atlanta, what are your costs? How much volume do you have to bring with you? including things like your hotel cost or new tires for a truck. So it's a tool to show them that, hey, even if you have these expenses, based off what we found that people are willing to pay, you're still there's a great demand and you still be able to make money. We are starting to see some companies, there's a family out of Savannah that they're already doing this. They are taking their products to Savannah and they are getting more money for it, but in all cases, it's not going to be for everybody. And this doesn't mean that all of Georgia's seafood supply now is just going to go to farmers markets. It's just not practical. But just from this initial findings, we are seeing that there's opportunities there to try and get more money for the fishermen and hopefully increase satisfy our customers. So there are a lot of opportunities looking ahead. I think the direct marketing, that research project was kind of a starting point. I think there's other opportunities of how can we get, the ultimate goal is to try to get better price for the fishermen and hopefully try to strengthen some of those distribution channels between the coast and local market. Even things like value-added products. Are there things we can do with existing products that, we can turn it in? The idea of these aggregate community-supported agriculture. Maybe instead of getting tomatoes, hey, is there a way to maybe pull shrimp and tomatoes? A lot of that has to still be worked out, but it seems like there's interest. It's just a matter of bringing the partners together. And then there's always going to be that outreach aspect. Okay, I'm shocked when I show somebody a whole shrimp. They don't know what it is because they're used to seeing it without the head or it's fried. So how we handle seafood is still, there's a lot of trepidation about buying seafood. That's why Americans eat most of their seafood out. The shellfish industry, I mentioned this earlier, I think there's a lot of potential here with the shellfish lab, not only with oysters, I think there's a lot of potential, but even other shellfish products, things like blood arcs. There's other types of clams that we could potentially look into, different grow out methods. There's going to be marketing aspects of that as well. A lot of socioeconomic research needs on our coast about existing fisheries, demands, how our fisheries changing. We need to have some baseline information about some of our basic infrastructure in the state that's not been done in a long time. And then a big issue in seafood these days is byproduct utilization. You have a bunch of shrimp heads from peeling. Can we do something with it? Okay, what about oyster shells? I know sometimes we've talked about that. They're already being used in some cases for things like living shorelines, but could it be used for soil enhancement, or what other types of products out there use the whole product? That is becoming big money in a lot of our industries across the country. Are there opportunities here? So that's a very simplified way of saying opportunities, but I think when it comes to seafood in Georgia and the region, there are a lot of opportunities, especially at an interdisciplinary level. All right, so that is a very broad overview of some of our seafood here in the state. There's Tori and my information, as you can see here. That is pronounced Fluech, as was mentioned earlier. So you got me on that one. But I appreciate you guys letting us talk. And if you have questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.